Welcome back to Deep Thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry I've been away for a little while. Just been really busy, holidays, all that good stuff. Hopefully we'll get things back on track. Still don't have a reliable place to record. And the weather has been atrocious outside, so, it just means a lot of editing and stuff. So I'm sitting here at my abode, at one of my computer stations here, where I've been learning a bunch of stuff over the holiday. Today I want to cover Charles Manson. I've been wanting to do this episode for half a decade because I was raised with all of the sort of off-the-shelf stuff. And then I started doing my math on kind of what they said he did and what they said happened. And then I started seeing the correlating history between a presidency that was feeding the world banks with this infinite war called Viet Nam to make sure that the American citizen went into debt to this European fiat currency, borrowing and borrowing and borrowing, plus taking our strongest men and sending them off to war to get killed. And that's an agenda, to make sure there's no decent standing army within a particular country. And now with electronics and all kinds of wild robotics, it's going to not matter whether or not we have flesh and blood, to go over. So you have this need for an intelligence agency to do to really just kill the hippie movement, which was people dropping LSD, a drug that doesn't damage your body, a drug that I think that unless you have it in your body and you don't know that you have it, which is the spiking routine, which is just, that would be really crazy, especially the younger that you are. It makes you see God. It makes you connect everything together. Real LSD, not a bunch of the knockoff stuff that can get you killed. So don't run out and just go, oh, I heard this thing and I'm going to take some LSD. And, I took it 3 times from the Grateful Dead drummer's wife, okay? So very, very choice batches that are real. But they needed to stop this. They needed to stop kids taking LSD, something they started in the first place, and they needed to make sure that anyone viewed from the Haight-Ashbury realm of San Francisco, aka hippie world, was demonized. So if you just showed up with any peace and love thing, think about it. I'm in my early 50s, and it's like, I remember my whole life, if you were a part of any hippie movement, it'd be just immediately knocking you down. Oh, a hippie fucker, okay? Isn't that interesting? They wanted no war, peace. There was a bunch of lazy bastards that didn't want to work at communes. We can handle that issue, right? Now, a lot of these hippies went off and created the best movies that we've ever seen in our lives, from 1975 to 1985. A bunch of those folks went off and created Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Tron, all these Blade Runner, all these movies, because they had seen the full spectrum of reality. I just mentioned that so you understand where those people went who were extremely talented and wanted to work. So remember what I told you guys about how they spy on you. The reason why you don't want to have this little catchphrase to say, well, I don't mind if they spy on me, I'm not a criminal. Go ahead and look at all my records. And I told you, giving you the James Holmes Colorado shooter example, your information allows them to construct a dossier on you to create a profile to make sure that you're the perfect killer. That they would believe, that the public would believe that you're a killer. So you don't want them to have your information. The internet is now giving them the best control they've ever had in their lives to look at who you are, to patch you into something. So back in the day, it was probably a little bit tougher. But Charles Manson's years of life prior to getting busted for this thing is unbelievably suited for what they were looking to do. Which is, one, they had to prove they had a certain type of guy who had a certain type of background and was predispositioned to behave in a certain way in public. If you tried to, well, I'm just going to give you an example. Unless they got a hold of someone like me and gave me shock treatment and some root therapy where my brain's just dumped out and they put a bunch of boogieman on me for like a couple months to the point I feel utterly insane. They couldn't take someone like you and me and throw them into court, and then there's this guy talking strange in court, talking strange in all the interviews. But Charles Manson, because of the abuse that he experienced as a young man, was a perfect dude for this. And we're going to get into it. But I just want you to know, he has admitted not being an angel, but he says he never killed anybody. And I sort of think that, and I'm going to share why I think this as we cover his past. I think Charlie is more talk than action, because he's got a lot of attributes of people that I've known throughout the years. Charlie's entire life for me is a defense mechanism. It is, I am small, I'm 5'3", I'm scrawny, and unless I got a gun, I can't stop anybody. The discipline that I have applied to the research in this is to look at all of his words from 4 interviews that he took, then researching his past and cross-referencing as much as I possibly can. However, after Charlie dies, we're going to start deprecating what people say about him, because there's some people in his life that I think have motive to lie about him, because quite frankly, once someone passes away, but you did have access to them, you can claim anything. And they're not there to defend themselves, right? So Charlie's born in 1934 as Charles Maddox. His mother's 16 years old, which they play up a lot in today's, historical recall that his mother was 16. And honestly, in 1934, if you didn't live in a major city, 16 was not that far off. I mean, we had girls in my hometown having kids at 14, to the surprise of their parents on both sides, but managed to raise great families. So it's not like right away you got a problem. However, for Charlie, it soon became a problem. He was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, and for those of you who are not quite sure, okay, well, I know it's in America, what does that mean to me? Cincinnati, Ohio, and Ohio in general, especially out in the sticks, just outside the city, is very, very similar to sort of your Kentucky hills, your Arkansas deliverance kind of worlds. You can get into some intense moonshine, very retro folks. I mean, because when we migrated over here, we went in these phases, and the misnomer that Hollywood always gives you the impression of is that everyone is at the same stage everywhere in the United States. No, when Dodge City was going tits up, Deadwood, South Dakota, Tombstone, they're going at different years and different decades. Well, New York City's built a marble and starting to build high-rise buildings in this gilded phase. We're all different. So he potentially grew up in some pretty backwards locations. His father actually had a name, Colonel Walker Henderson Scott Sr. Okay. And what's funny about it is his father is not a colonel. His father just had that name attached to him, which is actually kind of funny. But his mother gets married during this pregnancy of Manson, of Maddox, Charlie. And she marries a dude named William Eugene Manson. And so that's how he gets his last name. It's not like a rock star name pick. He's actually taking his stepfather's name. But they get married in 34, and they're divorced 3 years later. Boom. So it's busted back up again. But now, on August 1st, 1939, his mother gets busted. Her and her husband do an assault and battery, and she gets 5 years, and he gets 10 years. Okay. So it's automatically just blowing apart. Manson's world is exploding. His parents, which is who you end up looking up to, well, one, his father's gone. He's got a new daddy, and you're thinking, okay, everything's great. And then all of a sudden, new daddy's in jail for 10 years and got his mom in jail for 5 years, right? So he's sent off to his aunt, who he lives with until she's busted for grand larceny. Heavy drinker. And, there's all of these things that are occurring. This kid is a teeny tiny kid, It ends about 1942 with the aunt. So he's about 8 years old. But, I mean, you're trying to form a framework of how the world works, and everything just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. But Manson bounces in and out of foster homes. He gets stuck in disciplinary schools. They keep trying to correct this kid. And the problem is every time he travels, he gets abused wherever he goes. He gets abused by the people that run the schools. He gets abused by his foster parents. He gets abused by the kids when he shows up. Plus, he's this smaller kid. One of the things Charlie was documented in multiple destinations as doing is when he would get attacked by someone, he would imitate an epilepsy fit and he would talk gibberish and they leave him alone. And what's interesting about that is you're going to see that behavior in his future. When he gets cornered in a particular interview with somebody, Diane Sawyer, Tom Schneider, Geraldo Rivera, other interviews, when they start trying to push a narrative on him and there's nothing he can visibly do to stop that from happening because he lacks the vocabulary, he lacks the way of defending himself, plus he's in jail and it's just been decades, he knows he's going to die there, he starts talking gibberish. And that's his mechanism he's had since he was a kid. And what's interesting about it is there's nothing you could do to reply to someone talking gibberish besides sit there and listen if you are remotely an adult. You just realize this guy's got issues, right? But eventually he gets sort of in a parole situation in the Bay Area, which is the San Francisco sort of midway up California area, for those of you not familiar with all the geography over here. He has a parole officer. He starts hanging out in the Haight-Ashbury area, which is today just known for the remnants of the hippie movement. You can still go in and out of, if they haven't been bought up by immigrants and changed completely, you can go in there and you'll find hippie stuff. It's pretty interesting. While he's in the Bay Area, he gets over to Berkeley University. And I've been to Berkeley a couple times. I spoke there once. It's a sort of a rolly hill campus. So it's like, it's bizarre. When I was there the whole time, it's like, it's all on a hill, like almost a concert hill where you'd have a concert and it's not too steep to walk on, to sit on a blanket and stuff. But just every building is a little higher than the next one, depending on which direction you're going. But this is in the middle of the hippie movement where you've got kids sitting out with guitars and playing songs. And this is where Charlie starts playing a few songs. This has been made fun of 1,000 times in movies. But you have a bunch of super impressionable kids who think that rock and roll is, time travel. I mean, they're so impressionable. Here comes a guy that is talking some pretty heavy stuff. Plus, he's been through hell and back. And I'll tell you what, my journey has been hardly hell and back. But I've been through some things, and I know some people have been through way more than me, and I've sat in a room with a kid that's had a silver spoon in his mouth his whole life, in a good way, not a bad way. We would just reminisce about our stories, and then the kid who's rich, with the fathers worth multi-millions of dollars, he's never going to have to pay for shit in his entire life. He literally says to us, well, I wish I had a story. He wishes that he had this hero's journey, boom, Dagobah thing, right? And of course, my buddy and I are looking at each other like, no, you don't. And maybe we're wrong. I don't know. Maybe there is some major value in going off and meeting Yoda. But Charlie is that to these kids in Berkeley. I mean, he's born in Ohio. He's been in and out of juvie. He's been in and out of correctional facilities. He's got endless stories. And he probably is picking up a little bit of wisdom along the way because, hey, man, you can't stop learning. You just can't. Now, the other thing that's, it's going to sound, like sort of a woke statement, but it's not. There's rumors that Charlie was sexually molested as he traveled through these different avenues. I think most of the time when you say anyone has a foster parent, today, most people think, oh, so you had a rapist. That's exactly what you think. It's a sick situation. I know that in juvie halls, for sure, the sexual activity is forced upon the children. And you could be a guy, and a female will force herself on you. I have a friend of mine's son who sat and told us when he was in juvie hall, and it was because of the divorced wife didn't know how to raise a child in general, and so he ended up at juvie hall for stints at a time, and he's a very handsome guy, and he said, "Oh yeah," he goes, 3 or 4 women would come jump me at night, and he goes, I wanted to have sex, so it was fine. So I mean, it's a different world out there from the one they sell us, right? And I should note that the first time that Charlie's in prison is 1951. He's a puppy. So by the time he gets busted, he's got, he averages it up in a very interesting way, but I think it's not incorrect to say that he had 20 years worth of incarceration in one form or another before the Tate murders that became a big part of this, part of his entire destiny, right? In 1955, he gets married. Rosalie Jean Willis. He ends up having 2 children eventually, right? I just saw an interview with one of his sons, and the son was like, look, he goes, I see Charlie Manson the same way you see him. The dude over there who has this story. That's it. It takes him another 7 years to get in prison again, and he was a pimp of a 16-year-old girl. To be a pimp, you must be able to manipulate someone else. Now, his Berkeley days, to get back to that, is that by 1967, he's at Berkeley, and he's discovered LSD. He's also recorded as being involved with the intelligence agencies which were giving kids LSD and seeing how it affected people. Charlie's sort of a drifter out there. And so it makes sense that, he's out there he doesn't have a job. He's just manipulating any situation he can manipulate because that's all he's got. When you and I go out and we work or we perform a task and then we get rewarded for calorie energy to money conversion, we're controlling our lives. We're doing something. But if you didn't do anything for money, you're living off handouts, then you're going to have to, you develop the skill set of running your mouth and making money. So him being a pimp, for instance, is very apropos, wouldn't you say? He's learned to manipulate people. He finds, a 16-year-old girl who is, again, coming out of this envelope of the greatest era of America, but she's curious, flying quotes, ends up being a prostitute, right? Now, Charlie was also pretty clean cut until he gets busted. And so he claims, and I'm not totally convinced, but I think for the majority of his life he had short hair. He's a relatively handsome guy, but he's also really tiny. And we're talking about being 5'3" in an era where you couldn't be a police officer unless you were 6 feet tall. And usually malnourishment, stress, all those different things will contribute to the smaller form, right? Unless you have just a genetic trait, right? And so with Charlie, everything that could be piled up on this kid's back is happening. And imagine the transformation in his character when he has been losing his entire life. He's not actively trying to be a bad guy. First time he gets busted stealing something in a grocery store because he's starving to death, and his parent, his mom, is just completely AWOL, right? And I should say that within the institutions that he was thrown in back and forth with, he must have run away from one school like 25 times. Just kept running away and kept running away because, they didn't have prison gates around the place. So he'd just not show up when he's supposed to show up. So defying authority gets reinforced in him. What did I always tell you? You're good at what you do. And so this kid was forced to do the wrong thing constantly. And so when he finally gets a thread in the sweater where he can pull it out, run his mouth, and kids that are rich going to Berkeley University are listening to some hillbilly that came out of basically the Ozarks of Ohio, to mix metaphors, he's excited. He's excited, man. And then you have this drug that's coming out that kids are starting to take willingly, and it's not like, they all know it's happening. The professors at Berkeley know it's happening. But now imagine that. Imagine that you've been taking drugs your whole life because you're just on the back side of the coin. You're on the dark side of the moon. And then all of a sudden, the rich kids on the light side of the moon start taking it, and then they want to know all about it. Right? It's like when porn blew up in the world. all the sexual deviants were experts in every conceivable crappy thing that you could do. And so, you got, your Manhattan couple paying money to have an expert tell them how to destroy their life sexually, right? Now, the part about him being involved with some MK Ultra thing is very, very interesting. He's at Berkeley with a lot of scientific facilities, a lot of geniuses there. He's already got a lot of experience with little things. He says he never liked heroin, he never liked cocaine, he never liked anything big, just a little bit of weed and a little bit of LSD. Those were his two drugs of choice. But he said he really didn't like being out of control. And I would say that you have a guy who's kind of mentally unhinged to begin with because of his past. He's never had normal days. Imagine that. And it may be a self-defeating loop when it eventually gets there, right? But you and I have had normal days, and then we'll have crazy weeks and crazy months, and maybe even a bad year. But this dude has had every single day be bad. And he's trying to form a picture of society. And so here he is for the first time at Berkeley University having sort of normal days, but it's almost like when you agitate a frequency, he can't ever calm down back to complete, smooth, cool, relaxed, Humphrey Bogart, coolness. He can't ever get down to that level. Now, in terms of his life at this point, or for the majority of his life, he sleeps at places because he befriends someone, bums the sofa off of them. He's very sweet to them, and they just get wound up in his charisma. So at Berkeley, he gets about 20 people to kind of hang out with him on a regular basis. Plus, LSD, again, is becoming a global phenomenon, but especially a phenomenon here in the United States of America. And again, once you take it and you realize that, one, you can't abuse it, right? I could give you a bar, right, and say, I'm putting this inside your house. And every single day you could go to that bar and get drunk. Every single day. And you can get as drunk as you were the night before, and as drunk as you were the night before. Super extremist liquor people claim that this does happen eventually to alcohol, but it takes a long, long time of abuse. But LSD, when you take it and you have a major trip, and if I give you like 5 tabs day 1, the next day you have 5 more tabs, well, you won't feel like taking anything the next day because you're just like totally chill and relaxed. Let's say a week later I give you 5 tabs again. It's going to be probably 25% of what you had the first time. And if a week later you took 5 more tabs, it'll be 25% of 25%, 5% of the original thing. So it doesn't work the way that people say it works. The television industry, the movie industry, law enforcement, government officials, they've all lied their asses off about the true effects of true LSD, not the fabricated stuff that, isn't even LSD today. Because basically, if you take a drug today and it makes you feel funny, you don't really know what it is at this point, which is why you would never want to get anything from anybody where you didn't know its complete source. So now we're going to get into like 2 different realities. The reality that has been painted by the folks that wanted to body slam him and who got him to die in prison at 83 years old, and then potentially what really took place. We have to speculate what really took place. The way that history books write it is that by the time he's sort of finished 1968, he's got something called the family. And they're getting in trouble for being hippies. They're getting in trouble for getting caught sleeping naked outside. I mean, because it's a hippie movement thing, right? And they won't get remote like a lot of folks that went off and joined the communes or built communes. You're in the middle of nowhere. You can do what you want on your private property, which is where we're going to go here. But they start inserting this narrative that he has this family, and maybe it's like their collection. But imagine that you just have the fortune of building a friendship with, say, 6 or more people, and then a couple of years down the line, you get framed for some bullshit that you didn't have any direct responsibility for, and they say, well, this is when so and so came up with their cult. They called it the family, and you're looking at the evidence going, these are my friends. We didn't go around calling ourselves the family. So as I read it, Charlie was on probation because he caught these cases up in the Bay Area, and he's got, a couple of years of probation. And he's trying to escape this situation where it's like you got to report in, frequently to a probation officer and what have you. So he asked his probation officer, who is rumored to be, this is a sort of a connection, and it's the only way this makes sense to me. He's rumored to be connected to the MK Ultra experiment in a way that it's like, we got to watch, just, let him do his shit and let's just see what he does, because he's sort of like the living experiment of incubating something up that could take these hippies down. It's almost like they built this conspiracy. The second they realized that people who drop LSD don't want to go to war, they started building candidates that could be liquidated, So there's a place called Spawn Ranch. It's SPAHN, and it's way the hell out in the desert, okay? When I grew up, I thought this ranch was somewhere near the Tate House. It is nowhere near the Tate House, okay? If you were to drive from this Spawn Ranch to where the Tate House is today, it depends on what day you would be taking this trip, but you're going to be in that car for potentially 4 to 5 hours to get to this location. So it's not like they just hopped in a car and drove down the street, like in the, was it the La La Land movie that parodied the whole thing. And it's funny to look at it in Wikipedia too, because when you look up the Spawn Ranch, they immediately start inserting all of the Manson stuff. They can't lose sight of this story. It has to be reinforced. They know that people stop believing in things. They know that the next generations don't give a shit, but they want the next generations to believe in the history so that it props up all the other bullshit that they've come up with over the years, right? So this is where we get the clan of folks that are responsible for these murders, right? This is where we get into the potential motives for why this whole thing went down in the first place. And it's sort of like studying Kennedy, where, I heard it the other day. It's fucking unbelievable, man. It's like 2023, and this guy at the smoke lounge goes, you know what I heard? I heard who really killed Kennedy? The mob. The mob killed Kennedy. It's like, really? That's a brand new theory for you, bro? Seriously. Fucking guy knows nothing about what he's talking about, but wants to insert himself in a conversation to apparently have some modicum of intelligence. Just blows me away. So, if you look at all the narratives around Charles Manson wanting to go kill these folks and supposedly sending folks out, you've got mixed smoking guns. For the people that believe they know, they've got these mixed smoking guns. One is that Charles Manson got obsessed with doomsday theory, that somehow the whole world was going to fall apart. It's like, are you kidding me? If you've not walked in those shoes before, been around anybody who believes that, it's like doomsday means everything is horrible. Everything, the economy is horrible. Everything's horrible. You're suffering on a daily basis. Well, what's the algorithm of Charlie's life? Everything's getting better in the 60s. Yeah, sure, he's getting arrested. Yeah, whatever. I got naked, a little charge for being naked. But I'm taking drugs now a little bit. I got a following at Berkeley. I'm somebody now. But for the whole previous 2 decades of his life, he's born in 34. So 34, 40s, the 50s. He's got to get into the early 60s before he's starting to feel like he's somebody. And now he's starting to get on top. He's got a stick. So what's up with doomsday bullshit? We're going to get into his interviews because this is where he really revealed sort of his disgust for what was going on. But I just don't think he's at the level of trying to get people killed, because I think he understands what that rap means, right? The other one was he heard the Beatles song Helter Skelter, which supposedly kicked off his doomsday belief. He said he didn't really know who the Beatles were. He said he wasn't really a fan of their music. And what's interesting about it is, if you listen to the fact, and you may not know this, I didn't know this, Charlie had become a musician and was sort of a folk guy. And he had this story he could tell about all this, incredible journey he had. And he was more of a Bob Dylan dude. There is over an hour, I believe, recording of Charlie Manson playing the guitar and singing on YouTube that you can go listen to. And tell me if you think that the stuff you're hearing coming out of him has anything to do with the Beatles. He is singing like Bob Dylan, not none of this looking thing, but he's got that sort of, parable singing. Now, Bob Dylan was obviously much younger than Charlie, probably by 10 years at least. But there's this other narrative that he had been introduced to one of the Beach Boy guys from the band The Beach Boys, and that he was going to have a record deal. Now, having been a professional musician myself at times, when I listen to this 1 hour recording of Charlie, it's a very telling recording, because this is like he's not being interviewed, he's not in jail, he hasn't been accused of anything. Tate is still alive, You've got an extremely insecure dude on a guitar. And when you hear him play his little songs, he has, they're okay. But he's just got sort of melody progressions that probably 50,000 songs in America had at the time. And he's got little neat, metaphorical quips. Not bad. His lyrics aren't bad, but he is nowhere near, in my opinion, standing on stage and performing, being disciplined within a sound studio to get a record done. He's just a chaotic mess when he comes into this recording. And he is extremely, extremely nervous. And the thing is here's the thing, because I've been around hangers-on my entire life. I've seen them with the celebrities that I've hung out with. Some of them, every once in a while, will try to sniff my world and get involved. That's rarely ever taken place. But you've got these people that are basically, they have the patience to get enough talent to see that they could develop the talent to be a professional in what they're looking for. But they lack the discipline to actually get any magic. So they constantly just upgrade just the bare minimum to be able to sit in the room, pick up a guitar, play 2 or 3 licks, and then put it down, and then, I don't know anything else, which is fine. It's totally fine if you do that. Some instruments I'm exactly the same way, but I don't walk in trying to get a record deal, right? So the insecurity in this supposed monster on this recording, and the guy who's recording him is like, "Hey, Charlie, man, don't worry, man. We'll just let it run. You just play whatever you want to play, man." And he's like, "Hey, man, I love you, man. Love you, man. Love you, man." It's like, man, he couldn't be in a more friendly location. But Charlie knows. I guarantee you, Charlie knows and knew that he was never going to be a famous musician. He didn't have it. He didn't have the polish to his songs, and he knew it. He didn't have the song library, and he knew it. He didn't have the vocal talent, and he knew it. And he especially didn't have the confidence to be on stage and sing. I guarantee you he knew it. So this idea, and this is where we're going to get into the Tate killings, that he was a doomsday person, and that's why he's trying to strike out at the rich. There might be a little bit of truth to that one, but that's not a doomsday algorithm, believe it or not. And then there's him wanting to be a musician, and the former record executive that was renting the Tate house, he thought was still there, supposedly. This is one of the theories. They just superimpose shit on him, and then it's absolute fact, right? And he sent these people to go kill that guy. When you listen to Charlie, and we're going to jump around a little bit here, I apologize, but let's go ahead and do it. In his interview with Diane Sawyer, he basically says, "Look, my buddy was in jail." Like, it's Bobby. Bobby's in jail. He goes, when I was in jail, no one came for me because no one had any money, and I didn't have any money, so I couldn't call an attorney. In fact, he looked at Diane Sawyer. He goes, "What would happen if you went in jail?" He goes, "You call your mommy, and you get money, and you get an attorney, and you get bail." And he goes, "Not for us." He goes, "There's 2 different worlds. There's your world and my world." And he said, the reason why Tex took the girls back to this Tate house is because Tex is a moron, and morons just repeat what they know. And so he had been to the house before at a previous visit, so he went back to the same place. And he goes, "That's what it is." He goes, "A criminal mind is a mundane mind." This is Charlie Manson talking, the idiot, the crazy man, right? And he said he just went back to that house, and then things got out of control. He goes, at most, they were going to try to shake down some money to get Bobby out of jail, to get him an attorney. That was it. Not slaughter an entire family. But again, technically speaking, if Charles Manson was indeed involved with some MK Ultra program, and you would have to say early 60s, the first half decade of the 60s, from 1960 to 1965, and then it still kept going, okay? According to Kathy O'Brien, it went for a long time. And it's a real thing. People got lawsuit money out of the government for that one. If it's been going that long, they're watching this guy. And if they see something happen, they can orchestrate the whole thing, man. Just keep that in the back of your head. LSD will never make you kill anybody. Holy shit. I'll tell you why LSD won't make you kill anybody. Okay. The last thing on earth you would ever want to see on LSD is something truly horrific in the real world. Because whatever you see in the real world gets absolutely boosted. So if you were to hold like a beautiful crystal, oh my God, you're going to heaven when you're looking at that thing. But if someone were to walk up to your face and go, rah, like that with the mask on, holy crap. It just depends on what kind of person you are, how far you're going to run down that devil's anus when that happens to you. You would never want to hurt anybody, because if you saw someone cry, you're going to feel like crying. If you're going to see someone scream, you're going to want to run in terror. The drug does not push you over the limit. But of course, according to Charlie, he said that he didn't allow any drugs on that ranch, except for they didn't think that weed was a drug, and they didn't think that LSD was a drug. Weed back in the day was brown, very, very weak. It wasn't chronic. It didn't blast out your entire week to smoke it. And LSD was probably the most mild, beautiful stuff back in the day. Hence the stuff I actually consumed that was put in jars probably in the 70s and early 80s. But now I want you to, before we jump into the interviews and the information I kind of got out of that, there have been a couple series now on Netflix. And I guess there's a new one on Prime. The one on Netflix is one of the best ones I've ever seen. But it's a series about getting false confessions out of people. And the techniques that they do. They do crazy shit like you've worked an 8-hour day, and they'll come pick you up after you've worked your 8-hour day, and then they will hold you in a room, videotaping you and interviewing you and inserting in you, you did this, you did that. Well, why don't you tell me about when you killed her, da-da-da-da. For 14 hours until you'll say for 13 hours and 50 minutes, you will say that you had nothing to do with it. You're consistently telling the truth. And then all of a sudden in the last 10 minutes, because you want to go to sleep, you want to eat, you want to get out of there, these people will confess. And then all the other tape and all the information is typically discarded, and that little 10-minute piece is inserted into court as admissible evidence. So when you think about the folks that were captured, arrested for this gig, confessing, and then you're telling me, oh, but she said this and texted that and Leslie said this and all this other stuff. Keep in mind that it was potentially a deal to keep them out of the electric chair, in their mind. So when Charlie's asked by Diane Sawyer, and this is a 1993 interview I'm going to go with first, why did they kill these people? And he says, well, he goes, I think people were loaded. I think they were loaded on a lot of stuff. He said, as far as he knew, Tex had said that he, which is like this clean-cut American boy, he said he was coming down off LSD, but he was highly boosted on speed. And what I'm curious about is whether or not Charlie can ever get any information that's truthful. Now, during this entire Diane Sawyer interview, she is inserting loaded questions in him like crazy. Loaded questions like, well, when you killed your mother, how did you do it? Did you do it with a knife or a gun, And you haven't killed your mother. She's still alive, And so when he gets pushed into those things, because she asks him, what did they think they were doing for you? And he's like, I didn't tell him to do anything. And so he goes, and so she pushes him, come on, Charlie, just tell me this. She just inserts this on him like a bad psychologist, right? He says, well, if you were me and I was you, then everything I do is for me. He just says some circular logic thing to basically say, lady, what are you doing here? I'm trying to tell you the truth, and you're just disregarding it. So on August 8th and 9th of 1969, the the accused, Charlie not being one of them in terms of being physically there. I mean, imagine this, man. You never even went to a location and then you get accused of this. They drive from this Spawn Ranch, and look it up, man, Spahn, all the way into the Hollywood Hills. I suppose you could look up the exact Tate address. And they spend a couple days there. And it's Text and these TEX and these three women. And over the course of the 8th and the 9th, you've got murders that supposedly occur on the first night. And then this couple shows up the next day, and boom, they're nailed the next day. Now, if it wasn't bad enough, Sharon Tate was an actress, well known, and I think she was the Polanski's woman. I mean, she was really murdered, and she was pregnant. She was really murdered, and she was really pregnant, and somebody did it. So it's serious business, man. The perpetrators are Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Linda Kasabian, and Patricia Krenwinkel. They're responsible for the Tate LeBianca murders, which is what they call them. Day 1, day 2. And again, every single time the story is told, it is always Charles Manson told them to do this. Charles Manson told them to do this. Now, think about just the absolute legal ridiculousness that someone tells you to commit a crime, or even insinuates it'd be a great idea, and you go off and do it. And not only do the people that actually did it go off to jail and do all this, but the person that gets the most time is the guy that's accused of telling them to do it. And how fucking easy would that be? Seriously. You just robbed a bank. You did it all by yourself. But you just say in a court of law, my mom told me to do it. And you just tell a really elaborate story. Oh, she's been milking me for years to rob this bank because she needs that money. And she wants a fur coat and blah, blah, blah. And, and in the end, you're just accusing your mother of bullshit. And without any proof at all. Besides more cult leaders, besides more of these people that committed the murder saying, look, if you can finger Charlie, we'll give you a little bit of this, give you a little bit of that. Who knows what concessions were done? During the interview, after they start up on the murders, because she goes in, Diane Sawyer goes in, 1993 interview, pretty quickly. One of the women had said that Charlie told them to make it witchy. It was a very interesting sort of reaction from Charlie. Because he goes, I did say that, but he goes, when I say that I said that, he goes, I said it all the time. He goes, it's my way of saying, leave a mark. Like, if you're going to do it right. And of course, he's in the hippie era. He's from which no one was really aware of that word until later on when they categorized things and bundled up that history. But he said, look, I always said that. He goes, I always said that at the ranch. And he goes, I just said it to the women because they're into this thing. I mean, just think about it. It's like Stevie Nicks thinks she's a witch, okay? To this day, she thinks she's a witch, all right? So, I mean, the idea is like, this was an era of, I don't know, like taking acid, seeing the universe, not being able to interpret that universe, and then just having some cool catchphrases for, how to rebrand what your parents used to say or what your grandparents used to say. Diane asks him if, he told the people, because they scrawled this blood on the wall, which if you really look at the blood on the wall, it's not artistically done. It's not sort of, oh, let's just do this. It looks very intentional on the wall thing. They wrote pig, they wrote helter skelter, and they wrote rise. And he said, look, man, he goes, this whole helter skelter thing, he goes, that wasn't in my vocabulary. It wasn't something that I listened to and enjoyed, and let alone turn into some fanatical doomsday belief. He goes, that's something you've added to the story. So there was a woman in the posse named Leslie. Charles gets very pissed off when she's mentioned because he goes, look, man, he goes, Leslie had stopped by the Spawn Ranch for like 3 to 4 minutes before she took off with Tex and the others. And he said, she wasn't a part of our thing, and for her to act like she was embedded with me and I told her to do things is absolutely ridiculous. But Charlie mentioned a philosophical thing during the interview with Diane Sawyer, and he said, he had learned from some passage back where he came from that you're never supposed to kill anybody when they're afraid, because if you do, you're going to mess up your karma for the rest of your life. I think it's a very fascinating idea. So who knows, it does look like if you have those embedded beliefs like that, you typically don't cross over those lines. Like, I would never do that, like if you have a child, you may never kill yourself, because in your brain, you're going to think about your child getting the notification that you killed yourself. And, if you have a good relationship with your kid or you don't, like either you'll be the punk ass bitch that they thought you were, or it'll break their heart and destroy their lives, right? Why wouldn't you have gone to them first or something like that, right? So there's things that you don't cross when certain things happen. And it sounds to me like Charlie had a lot of those. So she baits him in a conversation, and a question basically says, do you want everyone just to walk away from you and just, free you and leave you alone? And he says, look, man, I haven't broken any law with God. I haven't even interrupted the man's game. And it's because from his perspective, he's like, I didn't tell anybody to kill anybody. If I bring a bunch of people together and on one particular evening they go nuts and do something crazy and then want to accuse me when they're loaded most of the time, right? It's like, oh, I know what Charlie said, but I was usually on speed. I was usually on LSD. I was usually on coke, whatever. Then in most cases, you wouldn't believe that individual. But in the case of Charlie Manson, whatever these people said, they believed. She asks Charlie, she pushes him, did you tell them to mutilate the bodies? And Charlie just responds like he's living that out while she said that, right? And he's like, look, I didn't tell anybody. He goes, I'm going to tell you what I said again. He goes, I didn't tell anybody to do anything like that, let alone murder. And because of his other philosophy of don't kill them when they're scared, how could you mutilate somebody without making them terrified? Of course, you could do it after passing. And he said, look, in the end, he goes, they're responsible for their own actions. Basically saying, well, why don't you go interview them? Don't interview me about what they did, which is fucking fascinating, right? I don't remember seeing any interviews with all the other people. I know they're out there, but there's a billion interactions with Charlie. She asked Charlie, do you think the world will forget about you? And he said, which world? He goes, and at this point, he doesn't give a shit about the answer. He wants to impress on Sawyer that there's two worlds. He says, look, there's an overworld and an underworld. You live in the overworld. I live in the underworld. And throughout the interview, he's basically telling her, look, he goes, the underworld's are the abused. And he says, it's getting a lot bigger because the more you abuse us, we get a lot bigger. And there could be some chaos, She asks him, is Charlie Manson crazy? And he says, whatever that means. And he reminds her, he goes, look, there was a time when history called you crazy, that was actually a compliment. And what's funny about it is this is probably 7 years before Steve Jobs had created, the Crazy One ad campaign. She asks him what he thinks about during the day, and he says, I try to keep my mind clear the whole day. She asked him if he was a changed man. He says, I was changed the last time I got out of prison. He goes, I learned my lesson. I never want to be back in here. But what's interesting about it is that in previous interviews, he said that, and I truly believe this, he feels more comfortable in prison than he did ever being in public because there's too much chaos in public. There's too much acting for him in public, according to him. And so in prison, he knows the system. She asked him what lessons that he had learned, and he says, I don't exist in this world. She poses a question about the 60s, and she says, do you think the kids were kids of those times? Which is sort of like, of course they were. Jesus Christ, lady. It's just a stupid question. But he answers it, and he says, I love the kids of those times. And he's really just saying, look, we were really good people back in the day. Now, meanwhile, he was a pimp. So I'm just going to talk about the other two interviews without dragging you guys through every single question. I thought Diane Sawyer's was probably the most interesting of the interviews that he took. There's interesting things in each one of the interviews. He does an interview with a guy named Tom Schneider in the late 70s. Tom is he just comes off as the most superficial scumbag you have ever seen in your life. Before he ever interviewed Charlie, I used to be up at night, and Tom would be on TV, and it's just, even as a kid, the guy just seemed like a fucking sleazeball. Like anything for money. Anything for money. He's like one of those caricatures in movies that's like the guy that will stab everybody in the back for $10, But he's doing the first hit piece. He is injecting into Charlie's world what Charlie did and why he did it. And if Charlie denies anything, oh man, it's, well, come on, Charlie, you're lying about that, and Charlie's like thinking he's going to get a chance to tell his story. And what he finds out is that the mouthpiece in each one of these interviews is not going to let him off the hook for the narrative that's been inserted on him. And he simply doesn't have the power to stop it. But he takes an interview with Geraldo Rivera next, who literally says in the intro of the segment that Charlie Manson, a man still possessed by Satan. He says this in the opening of the interview, like before Charlie's even on the screen. So Charlie hits Geraldo. And he's thinking, I've let some years pass, and I'm going to be able to control this narrative. And, Geraldo is just a big fucking prick. I mean, he's truly the nerdy prick who's like, wants to throw down. He seriously wants to go fisticuffs all the time. And just shy of having his fucking jaw shoved back through his fucking head and killing him, he's never going to stop doing that shit. But they got him by the balls because he and Anthony Weiner are child predators. They've been sending pictures to underage girls. So just remember that too. Which is why he was willing to throw down against the 9/11 truth people. He's a piece of shit, basically. It's always these scumbag pieces of shit that get an interview with Charles Manson. Never anybody with any intellectual power. And then, of course, Diane Sawyer, who is the sort of the super nerdy chick who kind of, got a little bit of the makeup going there, and then just acts like a pompous twat every interview she's ever done her entire life. And here comes Charlie. And I'm not saying those things just to defend Charlie. That's just the truth about those people, in my opinion, right? And so Charlie, third interview, man, he just can't get around the fact that no matter what room he has ever put inside of with cuffs, he's cuffed together, he's never going to be able to tell his story. He has mental issues to the point where he can't even really string it together really well anyway. And so they got him. If you see the Netflix special about people who confess to things that they didn't do and later were exonerated by either DNA or some other revealing confession, the people who confess have low IQs. Nonviolent index, low IQs. So below 90. Now, Charlie had some interesting, he's not an idiot. He has mental damage. He has been beat up. He has been molested. He has been raped. He's been in and out of prison and had to do anything he could to survive in that prison. But of course, he doesn't want to tell anybody what he had to do. He'd been in all kinds of different facilities, from foster homes, disciplinary schools, juvie halls, jail, prison. He had basically been chewed up inside this engine. Now, what's interesting is at the end of his trial, when they pushed him into trial, there's all kinds of weird rumors around the trial. Him threatening the judge at one point. They wrote up this whole piece about him threatening to kill the judge with a pen or pencil, probably pencil, and then they said, "Oh yeah, there's no evidence to corroborate that." The swastika that he has between his eyes, he actually initially carved an X, and the saying was he had been X'd from society. He does shave his head. They first say he shaved his head left horns, and walked into the courtroom. I can't find any photographs of that, and I find it hard to believe that they shot photographs of him every single day and they don't have that shot. Maybe I just missed it. I'm going to look it up here. If I can find, I'll put it in there. And then he finally ends up bald, and then all the women end up bald because they're kind of following him. Then they put X's on their head as well. And of course, he goes into prison where it's all racially divided up, Aryan Brotherhood, and of course they take that and make it a swastika. What's interesting about Charles Manson having a swastika on his forehead is that nothing he ever said lended itself to anything that was the doctrine of the Nazis. I mean, nothing. Zero. Not a supreme race thing. I mean, for God's sakes, Sharon Tate was a white woman. You know, it's like, why would all this stuff happen? He claims that he had never heard of the hippie movement until after he was incarcerated. Said he was a pretty clean-cut guy until he was arrested in terms of the way he dressed, the way he appeared. The earliest kind of mugshot picture of him, he's kind of got a leather hippie, top on, and he's definitely got long hair. So I don't know what the hell he's talking about in that realm. What's interesting about Charlie is that his story is consistent all the way to the end. And there was another interview with sort of a nobody. Yeah, there's a guy named Noel that met Manson in prison in the 1950s, and this is a guy. Seems like a guy would be very happy in a male prison, providing services to other males. And you have to take that into account when he has this sycophant obsession with Charles Manson. Very clean-cut guy in the later interviews in the 90s. But he is a person that once Charlie died was anytime he had his time outside of Charlie's world, he would say the craziest shit about Charlie, but when in Charlie's presence, he would give very fair assessments of their relationship and their friendship, which is that Charlie is definitely a Tasmanian devil, hard to control. We yell at each other every once in a while. It sounds like a normal friendship that would have been 40 years old. So be careful with opportunists that write stuff afterwards. When I was reading through Wikipedia about Charles Manson, which is just a packed, dense bunch of stuff, when you get to the end of the history of his life, you need to start realizing there's actually a visible dotted line in the paragraphs, and you cross that threshold, and all of a sudden it starts getting more flowerful and outrageous about who he was, and then you realize all this shit was written after he died, and it's cash time, man. It's book deal time. It's sensationalism time. Fuck that guy. He told those people to kill those people. Or who cares? Who cares? I have no soul and there isn't a God, so let's just go ahead and write whatever we want to make a buck off someone else's expense. The reason why this entire story just interests me is that you have this coup de grace moment to get rid of the anti-war movement. Now, you can get in massive trouble with an anti-war society if you've got a really intense wartime neighbor who's like, look at those pussies, we're going to just bomb the shit out of them and they'll be just mushing our hands and we'll erase their entire existence and take over all their land. It just depends on how you view yourself in this universe as to whether or not you need to fight for your flesh bag for the rest of your existence, right? But again, society has always done this. When there's hardship to survive, there's war, unfortunately, and everybody toughens up. Then you go a couple generations in, and the offspring, the third offspring generation, gets the benefits of the children of those who fought the wars. Basically, the baby boomers were the children of those who fought the wars. And this is where you get them and beyond getting raised and coddled in a world where they don't understand how anything works. Well, I haven't needed to do that in the past, so why should I have to do that now? You've got to be wrong, because then life starts sucking more, that the entitlement starts making ignorant people. Right? My generation struggles to have any level of education and jobs and what have you, right? And just further down, worse, all the way down. And so you go up, they don't understand it, and they think you're full of shit. Because they're so close-minded, so myopically stuck in the past, right? I think to understand, and I don't say I'm not an expert in Charlie Manson. This is just my first volley into sort of what I didn't know about him. I did know he had 20 years in prison before he was put in prison in late 1969. I did know everybody that was actually a part of this thing. I didn't know he was inducted into MK Ultra experiments through Berkeley University. I didn't know that he could just call his probation officer and say, "Hey, I just want to move to a ranch in Southern California. Can I get a transfer of probation down to SoCal?" "Oh yeah, sure, go ahead." Because what is probation? It's privilege. It's fucking do whatever the hell you want. There's shit that just doesn't make any sense unless he's a little experiment being, incubated off to the side. It seems to me like there's a little bit of kind of suspicion that supposedly, for whatever reason, they went to the Tate House, that Charlie was supposed to be baited into that, and he was supposed to go so he could be the absolute fall guy. Because all the other people that committed these murders, they don't match any profile of anybody would ever do that. I mean, the quantum leap between them existing, say, like 2 years before they ever went there, and killing these people and mutilating them, and then scrawling this stuff in blood on the wall. I mean, for all we know, they're fucking not even dead. They're relocated somewhere, yada, yada. But it feels to me like Charlie was supposed to be put in that, and that they had written all the narratives around the fact that Charlie was the one that actually pulls it off. Charlie Manson going down for the Tate LaBianca deaths is like when the Olympic, not the Titanic, sinks in the Northern Ocean up there, and the boat that was supposed to rescue them all, either he got lost or the Olympic got off course. And when they took everyone to Northshire and put them in an outdoor warehouse and said, "You got to sign a non-disclaimer, otherwise you can't go home." And then they took everybody to court for who was responsible for the Titanic, aka Olympic, going down. The main person that was found guilty was the captain of the ship that was supposed to rescue them. Well, since this is not a planned event, how can you possibly say, "I wrecked my car here on the 405 and the 110, but a guy, my buddy in Santa Monica, he's the one responsible for my accident, killing a bunch of people because he was supposed to be here to pick us up"? It just doesn't make any sense. One thing that Charlie said to the judge was, "What law have I, violated here? Even if you say what I said was true, even if what you said was true, where I insinuated that someone should go hurt those people." He said, "I knew them. I didn't tell them to kill anybody, but they did." He said, "You're part of the government, Mr. Judge. The government is over in Viet Nam killing the crap out of people for no reason whatsoever. And you're not doing anything. And you're a judge. You're a judge. And you're not doing anything about it. So you're guilty of more deaths than I am by proxy, by knowing that it's happening and not saying anything about it." I think, too, one of the things that we have to recognize is this is a long time ago, 50 years ago, and some change, and that the game was that good. Regardless if he instructed anybody to do this stuff, the Mockingbird game was that good. The fixing judges and attorneys and all that stuff was that good. And we know it was that good. There's plenty of movies in the 30s, 40s, 50s that have these sort of, getting framed sort of things and using the press to do it. There was no way Charlie was ever going to dig himself out once they decided he was the one. He would have had to have had a leveled mind, no abuse, no mental illness of any kind. It looks to me like and again, we don't know what might have happened to him when he was behind closed doors. We had a Marine once back in, what was it? It was 2005. He was abducted from his house because he was posting online some truth about an event on September of 2001. And they finally managed to put a bunch of internet people came out and said he was captured, and they got it on video, so they had to release him because he got videotaped being stuffed in a car. It's really disturbing. I mean, it's not a big deal. It looks like a cop's video where they're dragging a criminal in the back of a car. If you really think about it, this is intelligence grabbing someone to make sure they don't reveal the truth about something that went really wrong. When he got out, he did a radio circuit And he said, I was put in a room, and he says the guy that was with McVeigh in 96, who was his attorney, he goes, that dude was in my face telling me that he could make me think anything that he wanted me to think. I think this dude was a Marine too. So you just never know what the truth is. The hippie movement had to go down to keep Viet Nam going. One fell swoop, the whole thing was over, man. And if you really think about the esoteric goal of getting rid of LSD out of the market, getting rid of the hippie movement, and making sure there's no resistance to the banker-controlled wars that are nonsensical and infinite, the Manson situation, the Tate LaBianca deaths are unbelievably efficient. All the visuals were there, painting on the wall, being a famous person, being pregnant, some ooga booga group of people out on a ranch. Manson said, he goes, look, I didn't know anything about the word hippie, and I had no idea I was a cult leader. He goes, my favorite musician in the entire world was Bing Crosby, not the Beatles. Listen to his music online. He's more like a Bob Dylan, personally. So anyway, tough episode to do. This is one of the reasons why it took so long to get this thing going. Hopefully I can get a good stream of these things going out. I'm definitely taking a little bit of a break. My brain has been on overload, but all good stuff. Learning some new craft. Anyway, if you haven't been to deepthoughtsradio.com, please go. I'm not going to say anything else. To the Patrons and PayPal people, thank you so much. You make it happen. Take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you on the next Deep Thoughts. Over now.